Hi, everybody. As we are moving toward your first essay, I need to bring up the concept of fake news and what it is and how we are living in what you would call the post-truth era, the concept that we are in an era defined by its a problematic relationship with what is and is not the truth. Your first essay is a definition essay, which means your argument is going to be about defining a certain term. In this case, you're going to be defining the term fake news. And the argument is about how to define that term. You will be setting forth certain criteria. Criteria is a term that means these are like your requirements. In order for something to be called fake news, it must meet these requirements. It must meet these criteria. A criterion is the singular form of that word. Criteria is the plural if you're talking about multiple criteria. Some students have trouble with that term, criteria, or a single criterion. But it's pretty common term, so I just want to address that real quick. Your definition argument will have a criteria match structure. So you will not only be making the argument that the term fake news should be defined according to certain criteria that you choose, you will also be arguing about a specific example that you choose, arguing that some example is a good example of fake news because it meets the criteria that you set forth, or that some example you choose is not fake news and shouldn't be called fake news because it doesn't meet the criteria that you've chosen. In order to kind of introduce you to this topic, I have a bit of a presentation to give. So let me share my presentation with you and we'll go through this together. So I want to talk about defining fake news in the quote-unquote post-truth era. Scare quotes around the term fake news as well, because as you'll see, there's some disagreement about what fake news means. So as we, let's move through this, I want to start with a question. Look at this post. Here's a post that appeared on the website Imager. It says Fukushima nuclear flowers. The text of the post says, not much more to say. This is what happens when flowers get nuclear birth defects, right? So this is referring to the nuclear disaster of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan. This image was posted on Imagers, a photo sharing website, in 2015. So my question to you is, does this post on Imager provide strong evidence about the conditions near the Fukushima Daiichi power plant and why it does or does not? Feel free to pause the video as you consider your answer to this question. Now, assuming that you have examined this photo and given it some thought, again, paused the video and thought about whether or not it provides strong evidence about the conditions near the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, I'd like to talk about that. This was an example that was used in a study by Stanford University. This study was a statistically significant study. They took high schoolers, a large number of high schoolers and college students like yourselves. Among those who were surveyed, 40% said that this was strong evidence because it was pictorial. As in something that is a picture is automatically good evidence that it is true. 25% said that it was not strong evidence because it just showed the effects on the flowers and it didn't show the effects on people or animals, right? as if it was limited. I guess that's a good point. It's limited to just the flowers, right? Only 20% questioned the source, though. And that's the real issue here with this picture. Anyone who knows anything about Imager knows that it's an anonymous site. Anyone can upload something without revealing their identity. To go back to the picture, it was uploaded by a user named Please Google Shaker Amer. Please Google David Kelly. It sounds like a conspiracy theorist who's urging people to Google people's names. It is, I mean, it's not their name. It's an anonymous user who has posted this. If you know anything about Imager, this website was created in order to host images that can be then shared on Reddit. You see the Reddit sharing button over there. There's nothing stating, there's no proof that these images, that this was even a picture of flowers taken where they said. Maybe it wasn't even in Japan. Maybe it has been altered, right? There's no evidence that this is a reliable source. And what this study showed us was very few students your age or in your peer group, college students, as well as high schoolers, thought to question a source. And this is at the heart of what I want to talk about in this class, at least our starting point, as well as something that I want to return to throughout. Information literacy is, or thinking about where we get our information from and whether or not it can be trusted and how to navigate information online is of the utmost importance now more than ever. Some questions for you. What does fake news mean to you? Fake news means different things to a lot of different people. We hear politicians use it as a kind of an insult all the time, throwing it at whatever news organization they don't like. But of course, that's not even really how the term fake news started or how it was used originally. So what you are going to be thinking about in this definition essay is, what does it mean to you? How would you think about fake news? What kind of thing would you call, quote unquote, fake news? Have you or someone you know, have you fallen victim to fake news being shared? Is there someone you know who's constantly sharing fake news or inaccurate news of some kind, and you call them on it, or you just see them sharing it? Odds are likely that yes, you have seen fake news being shared, and you have maybe even called someone on it, or suggested that maybe you've fallen for it yourself and shared it yourself. Now there are a couple of activities in the beginning of this first week where I'm asking you to choose one word where you are explaining what fake news means to you, a word to describe what fake news means to you, and we'll look at a word cloud of what that looks like and what different students' opinions of fake news are. There's also going to be another activity where you give me an anecdote, like a story, a personal story about a time when you saw a fake news story, or you saw someone you know sharing it, something like that. So this is something I want you thinking about at the beginning of this course. And then I ask you, what does it matter if we can't tell real news from fake news? Think about that for a second. Something that's very important when we talk about argumentation, making an argument in an academic setting. Something that we talk about is developing the stakes for your argument in the beginning of an essay, talking about why this issue matters, appealing to something called kairos. likely heard of the rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, pathos, and I'll review those for you in a textbook reading in the course, in case you aren't as familiar with them. But there's another one, kairos, that is about appealing to your audience based on something being timely, something being important, especially in the current moment. And I think that this issue is especially important. It has been very important since, it's been in the zeitgeist, you'd say, and it's been in our cultural, the forefront of our cultural of our culture and of our minds since the 2016 elections, which we will talk about. And of course, it's very important right now during the coronavirus age and the 2020 election cycle. So this is something that I think is a perfect time, basically, for you guys to be taking this course. So yeah, why does it matter if we can't tell real news from fake news? Well, hopefully you guys understand that news journalism, legitimate journalism, is a cornerstone of our democracy. And we're going to get into politics quite a bit in this class. It is very important to have it's one of our basic freedoms in the Bill of Rights, the free press, right? The press, journalists, newspapers, or television journalism, whatever it is, are so important to making sure that our politicians, our representatives, aren't using too much power, are representing our needs, aren't hiding things from us. The free press and a strong press ensures the health of a democracy. They speak truth to power, if you've ever heard that saying, meaning that they will hold powerful figures to account, revealing scandals and corruption and things of that sort. If we can't tell real news from fake news, then that means we lose trust in all journalism. Right? And that's something that I hope you get as we enter this idea of the post-truth era. It's not just about not being able to tell what's real and what's not, what's truth and what's not. It's about the ability of people to cast doubt on things that are demonstrably true, that can be demonstrated to be true and accurate. If people are able to cast doubt on things that are true, and there's evidence to show that they're true, then it's possible to mislead people even more easily, to convince people that they shouldn't trust the people that they should trust, right? To gaslight, if you've ever heard that term, gaslighting, meaning try and make people think they're crazy for believing something that's actually true, right? The post-truth era is about more than fake news stories spreading on social media. It's about the future, not only the future of our country and the democracy, it's about the future of humankind. And the idea that even in an advanced age, when we have all of this technology and you'd think we'd have all of this information at our fingertips, because of an information overload, because of the nature of the internet and how things have worked out on the internet, we actually are less certain about the information that we have than ever before. The post-truth era, you've heard this term, the post-truth. What does it mean to be post-truth? Is a funny comic strip here, a game show called Facts Don't Matter, where the host says, "I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points." Of course, we don't want to live in a place when someone who's right can seem wrong to everyone else because people who are wrong are louder, right? I'm reminded of a line from a poet. Let me try to look it up really quick. It's the poem "The Second Coming" by Yeats, W.B. Yeats. A line of his poem says, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." And this comic kind of reminds me of that. The worst, the people who are wrong, the people who are wrong are the loudest. They're full of passionate intensity, and they'll shout down someone who's right, someone who is has the truth on their side, and yet they lack the conviction to raise their voice in opposition to someone who's wrong. It's like the world is upside down when something like that can happen. Let's see here. Here's some examples of things that some people might call fake news. Subpoenaed Trump Organization financial documents reveal company's only holding is single Dairy Queen in New Jersey. This is not a true story. It certainly looks like a news story. It says news, right? News in brief. It's got a headline, but what it's saying is false. But not only is it false, it is meant to be funny. Saying they are beginning to perceive the full scope of the secretive business deals. Investigators working for special counsel Robert Mueller announced Friday that subpoenaed Trump Organization financial records show the company's only discrete holding is a Dairy Queen franchise. This is not true, but it's what's called satire or parody. Our first reading actually calls it parody rather than satire. I would call it satire. The Onion, if you're familiar with it, it's not meant, it doesn't want people to think that its stories are true. Because if people read an Onion story and they think that it's true, then they miss the joke, right? The joke here is that Trump portrays himself as a rich person. Wouldn't it be funny if the Mueller investigators found out that all he owns is a Dairy Queen when he claims to be this billionaire with vast real estate holdings? Sometimes the humor in the Onion is more overt than other times, but some would argue this is fake news because it's not true. It is presented in the style of news, right? It looks like news. It's not true, right? These are possible criteria that you could use in your definition essay. Does it appear like news? That's one of my criteria. It needs to appear like news. Does it have false information? Yes, it has false information, right? But another criteria that you might want is that it has the intention to deceive. And if that's a criteria to be considered fake news, I would argue that the Onion is not intending to deceive. It's meant as a joke, right? If that's one of your criteria, even though it meets the others, yeah, it looks like news and it's got false information, but it doesn't have the intention to deceive. So I would argue it's not fake news. That's the kind of thing that you're going to be doing in your first essay. You're going to be arguing that something is or is not fake news because it does or doesn't meet criteria that you choose for fake news. Here's another one. Leaked audio. Barack and Michelle call Malia after watching her twerk on stage. Leaked audio. Barack and Michelle call Malia after watching her twerk on stage. Sounds like Obama was disappointed, but Michelle was mad as hell. Malia's made headlines lately. Okay, between the smoking and the twerking. Okay. So think about your criteria again. This is false information. We say does it present false information? Yeah, it meets a criteria of presenting false information. does it have the intention to deceive? Like the Onion didn't have the intention to deceive, but this one, this one seems like it's intending to deceive you. They're saying, I don't think there's a joke, an actual joke in here like there is. There's no satirical purpose as there was with the Onion. They're trying to deceive you. Does it seem like news? Well, I'm not sure. I would argue that it doesn't say the word news like the last one does. It doesn't say, where does it say? It says, first of all, it's just something that some guy, it's just something that some guy named Jonathan Fraser shared. So does just a social media post count as news? I would argue no, it doesn't. It's not from a news source. It's got to seem like it comes from a news source. Well, he linked something from spinzon.com. Well, that's clearly not a news source. It doesn't seem like it's a news source. A lot of times real fake news tries to pretend to be a recognizable news source, like it'll try to pretend to be abc.com, but it's actually abc.co, and it changes the URL slightly, and you need to be aware of that if you are finding sources online. You need to check the URLs to see if it's actually a legitimate news source. Also, the other question is, if it doesn't appear to come from a news source, if that's one of your criteria. It may not be one of your criteria. You guys choose your own criteria. Another possible criteria that you might have is the intention behind it. Is it there? We talked about does it have the intention to deceive? But what about the motivation? Is it what motivates it? Some people say that fake news is really motivated by politics, to try to influence you when it comes to politics. So, that Onion article, maybe you could say that it does because it makes Trump look foolish, it kind of makes a joke out of him. Maybe it does meet that criteria. Does this one? I don't know. It doesn't really, it presents the president as like a concerned or upset parent. I wouldn't argue that it really influences politics. If you're talking about false information that is meant to persuade someone to change their political beliefs or think in a certain way, you're really talking about propaganda, and that's a good term to think about: propaganda and disinformation. This one, I would say the motivation, it's kind of like clickbait, and maybe clickbait is something that you think is fake news. If that's the case, then your criteria would need to match that. You would say that it doesn't need to seem like news. All that's important is that it's presenting false information, right? That it's motivated by making money to get clicks, right? That it spreads easily, or something like that. It has the intention to deceive. So whether or not it actually appears to be from a legitimate news source, maybe that's not your criteria. Here we go. Here's a legitimate news source, Newsweek. This was back during Obama's bid for re-election. No, his first election, I believe. The wimp factor. Is he just too insecure to be president? Or why are Obama's critics so dumb, as says here? So this would suggest why, they're really unfairly covering him in a negative light and then portraying him as in a positive light. If that's the case, then you've got partisan bias. And maybe this is an aspect of fake news that you want to talk about. So sometimes people talk about whether or not a legitimate news source like Newsweek or a certain news channel like Fox News or CNN, whether or not that is fake news because it has such a partisan bias. It's being unfair to the other side. So if something has a partisan bias. What criteria does it meet? Well, is it spreading? Does it look like a legitimate news source? Yes, they are legitimate news sources. They at least appear like a legitimate news source. They are considered by many to be legitimate news sources. Is it trying to influence politics? If you're talking about the motivation of influencing politics or making money or something like that, like clickbait, then yeah, influencing politics, then you could argue, yeah, with their partisan bias, they're trying to influence politics. Are they presenting false information? Well, then it's a little tricky. If that's one of your criteria, presenting, it has false information, well, then a news source that's just has a partisan bias, maybe they're just imbalanced. Maybe they cherry pick the things that they cover, right? In that case, if you want to call that fake news, then that's maybe different from the other things that are actual hoaxes, where they're giving you false information, right? This is a website I'll be talking about more as the class goes on, mediabiasfactcheck.com. It's a useful source that allows you to look up news providers, and it tells you where on the political spectrum they have with bias. But what it also tells you is it talks about their factual reporting and whether or not they have a good or a bad record with reporting facts or reporting falsehoods. So these are things that you can always look up and investigate for yourself when you are looking into a source. Let's see here. Hoaxes or complete fabrications. Like we were just saying. Here's one. Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president, releases statement. So this is the kind of thing that, and this is what the term fake news was first used to describe, the kind of stuff that was spreading during the 2016 election that our sources are going to talk about. This was not true. Pope Francis did not endorse Donald Trump. It seems like it's coming from a news source. It says it's WTOE 5 News, but this was a fake website made to look like news, but it wasn't. There's no joke here. They weren't trying to make a joke. They were just presenting false information, trying to deceive people, right? So does it look like news? Yes, that's a criteria. If that's your criteria, does it look like news? This meets it. Is it presenting false information? Boom, yes, this meets it. Is it trying to influence politics and people's political opinions? Boom. Motivation? Yeah, it meets that as well. So depending on what your criteria are here, these hoaxes or complete fabrications, a lot of times, they're going to meet it. But sometimes if you aren't considering certain, if you have these criteria, for example, sometimes it rules out others. Like it may rule out news satire or something that doesn't try to seem like news. It's just spreading in a viral way, or it's just clickbait, right? Here's another hoax. If I were to run, I'd run as a Republican. They're the dumbest group of voters in the country. They believe anything on Fox News. I could lie and they'd still eat it up. I bet my numbers would be terrific. From People Magazine, 1998. Okay, well, I would argue, first of all, this was just something that spread on social media. And it's claimed to be from People Magazine. So you might say, oh, it's fake news because it's claiming to be from this publication. But if it's just a picture, like a meme that's being pasted into social media posts, maybe you can argue that doesn't appear to be from a legitimate news source. Also, People Magazine isn't necessarily a reliable news source, but this wasn't even in People Magazine, right? It's a falsified photo, or it's a photo taken out of context. Is it presenting false information? Yes. Is it from a legitimate, or does it seem like it's from a legitimate news source? I mean, it's saying it's from People Magazine, even though that's not true. So maybe you could argue it does meet that. Is it trying to influence politics and political opinion? Is it disinformation, like we were talking about, propaganda? Yeah, I would say that it meets those criteria pretty well. So brainstorming for criteria for your definition essay on fake news. Maybe you decide on your example case first. Maybe you decide on a specific news story or a specific thing like what I was just sharing with you, or a specific example from one of the articles. Our articles, the Defining Fake News and Social Media and Fake News in the 2016 election, our first two readings, they provide numerous examples, and you can quote from those articles to give your examples. You know, they talk about things like Pizzagate. You could use that as your example case. They talk about things like some of those things that were spread in 2016 election. You know, decide on your example case first. And your example case could be not even a specific story or a specific post that went viral. It could be a whole news organization. Like, people say CNN is fake news, but it's not, because it doesn't meet, you know, these criteria or this one criteria for fake news. Or people say, you know, The Onion is fake news, but it's not, because it's, you know, these are the criteria for fake news and it doesn't meet this one. So what do you want to argue is or is not fake news? Should be a specific story or a specific post, or it could be a specific news organization, like I said. Decide on your criteria for what is fake news. Where does it come from? Does it have to seem like it's from, you could say one criteria, my first criteria for fake news, right? The first is that it needs to appear to be a news source. If that's your criteria, it kind of rules out a lot of, you know, just social media rumors and conspiracy theories. It rules out the news satire and things that are meant to be jokes, you know. So does it have to seem like it's from a legitimate news organization or from a site pretending to be a legitimate news organization? If not, if seeming like it's from a legitimate news organization is not one of your criteria, then maybe it could just be a post that's shared on social media. Or really, if you want to get into it, if there's a post on social media, like a tweet or something, and it's from a famous person, like a public figure, like a tweet from our president, does that count as news? It's just a social media post. It certainly gets treated like it's newsworthy. Or is it only news as soon as it gets picked up in news media? Yeah, so what about if it's from spammers? If it's from you know, it's clickbait from people that are just trying to get clicks, right? Is that still, what if it's from Russian trolls, which is one source of fake news? What if it's from a political campaign? Does this matter? Does it have to actually seem like it's from a news organization, or could it be just something that, you know, looks like the graphics of news, even if it doesn't say the word news? If it's from a hostile foreign country. Further criteria for fake news: what are their intentions? What are their motivation? Does it have to have the intention to deceive? The Onion, you know, a news satire, it doesn't have the intention to deceive. It's trying to make a joke. But you could argue, if intentions to deceive are not a criteria, if you don't choose that as a criteria, if you say, then you could argue even something that could be accidentally thought to be real could be called fake news. Even if it's meant as a joke, if there's a chance someone could think it's fake, then that's fake news. What if it's a mistake or a misunderstanding? We have an example of that in a test case, or a case, I'm going to talk about it here in a minute, of a rumor that went out online. If it's just a rumor, but it goes viral, could that count as fake news? Does it matter if it was done to influence politics or just for money, right? Does the motivation matter? Does it have to be disinformation meant to like propagandize for some political tool? Or what if it's just something trying to get clicks? So here's this case study I was talking about. This is an accident. It's called fake news, though. People call this fake news. There's a New York Times article called "How Fake News Spreads," a test case If you wanna look it up, that's the URL. You can pause the video and look at that URL. I'm not going to pull it up, I don't think. This guy, Eric Tucker, he started a protest in Austin. Or no, he didn't start the protest. He reported on a protest. He said he saw some buses and he said, "Oh, look, they're busing in protesters to fake protesters against Trump." He only had 40 Twitter followers. He didn't think it was going to blow up into a huge thing, but it became a nationwide conspiracy theory. And it was pretty quickly debunked. The buses were there to bring people in for a certain convention, but he had like made a cursory Google search to see if there were any conventions. He didn't think there were. And so he started this rumor. It went viral. And a lot of people, even the president-elect, tweeted about it, like there were fake protesters. And later he said, he took it back and said, "Oh, I guess I was wrong." Well, this wasn't, something like this wouldn't meet a lot of those criteria that we were talking about. And yet people call it a perfect example of fake news. So if that's a perfect example of fake news, then what are the criteria? Does it need to appear to be a legitimate news source? Well, this isn't. This is just some guy's tweet. He had 40 Twitter followers. So maybe that's not. Does it have to have false information? Well, yeah, it has false information. Okay, so it meets that one. Does it have to have the intention to deceive? According to this guy, he didn't have the intention to deceive. He thought he was right. He thought he was on to something, right? So there's the possibility that maybe the intention to deceive is not a criteria that's necessary. Motivation to influence people's political, maybe you could argue, yeah, he was very political tweet. It really depends on what your test case is and what you want to say about it, what your example is of something you think is fake news, and what or something you think is not fake news. So once you settle on your example, your criteria should come naturally, right? If I were going to argue that this is fake news, then I would not argue that the intention to deceive is a criteria. And I would not argue that appearing to be from a legitimate news source is a criteria. I would argue that you got to have false information, right? And maybe I come up with another criteria, like it needs to be widespread. It needs to go viral enough that it gets covered by the news, right? And it's got into the news, but it didn't originate from a news source. So maybe you argue that it needs to go viral, right, and be widespread and get shared a lot, and it needs to have false information, right, and people need to believe that it's true or something like that. Once you have your example, then you can find your criteria for your argument. And then you start in your argument, you start with your criteria and your definition, laying out your criteria. And then in your paper, as it goes along, you can talk about each of your criteria, giving examples, quoting from our articles, because all of our articles are going to touch on different criteria in certain ways. And then you get into making the argument about your example. So decide on your example case. Decide on your criteria. Facticity is something that our first reading talks about. Facticity. Does it have to give false information? What if it's true information, but it's presented in a satirical way? What if it's true, but it's not complete information? Then you start to get into that partisan bias or incomplete reporting. And if you wanted to argue about a legitimate news organization being quote unquote fake news. What if it's true information, but they spun it in a certain way to promote a certain bias, right? So if you are arguing it needs to have false information, then you can't really make that argument about like a news organization just leaving out certain things or being more favorable to one side of the political spectrum, that's not necessarily false information, if you get what I'm saying. That's what you call editorial direction. And the truth is, all news organizations have an editorial direction. It doesn't make their news reporting false or less trustworthy. Really, they should separate opinion from news in their publication, and most reputable ones do. But all news organizations present opinion. It's called editorial. So, I mean, I don't like calling news organizations fake news based on a political political direction that they take in their editorials. But this is up to you to define fake news. So fake news has been around a long time. This is something that you could talk about in your essay. Here's an article in the New Statesman. It's talking about the history of fake news. You can follow that URL if you want. You can pause the video and find that URL. I'll click on it and pull it up. So this article talks about the art of the big lie, the history of fake news from the Reichstag fire. The Reichstag fire was when Hitler took control of Germany, and it was based on fake news, claiming that his political enemies, the communists, had burned down their parliamentary building. And then the communists in turn said, no, the Nazis burned it down themselves. And the truth was, it was just one guy, one like drunk guy who busted into the place and set the fire. He was a communist, but it wasn't a whole plot like Hitler convinced everyone it was. This talks about a lot of fake news, anti-Semitic or racist conspiracy theories against Jewish people, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a forgery that claims conspiracies by them. The picture I put here on this slide, it's going back to newspaper hoaxes from a long time ago, the 1800s. They're talking about, there was a newspaper hoax that said some astronomers were able to see a civilization on the moon, and there were bat-winged people who lived on the moon. And we discovered alien life on the moon, and they have these bat wings. And here's an illustration of what it looks like. It was just a hoax. Newspaper hoaxes were very common from a long time ago. A long time before the 2016 election, there was such a thing as hoaxes and unreliable news organizations, and fake news. It was even a term back then. So today, what's different is the internet and the rampant spread of propaganda, more than maybe we've ever seen it before, because it's so easily spread through social media. Some of the forms of unreliable news are more dangerous than others. Propaganda, definition for propaganda is ideas or statements that are often false or exaggerated, and that are spread in order to help a cause, a political leader, or a government. So if one of your criteria has to do with the motivation to influence politics or influence people's opinions on politics, then you might bring up this term in your definition, that it's propaganda, a form of propaganda. Disinformation, false information that's deliberately and often covertly spread by planting rumors in order to influence public opinion and obscure the truth. So if you are talking about the intention to deceive, and spreading false information, right? We have this term, disinformation. This could come up in your definition. So I ask you the question: what happens when major news outlets with a history of reliability and credibility are labeled as fake news by those who see certain stories as hostile to their agenda? So we see this all the time in our current presidential administration. I don't like the way you cover my, you've been critical of my administration and of me, so you're fake news. And in fact, we have a president who will actually try to kick people out of conferences, or move them to the back of the room, or he'll just storm out because he doesn't like a question, and he says they're fake news if they ask a question that's tough for him to answer and makes him look bad. So what happens? What's that going to result in when we have a major news outlet like he has called the New York Times as fake news spreaders? Of course, he calls CNN and some cable news networks fake news. They have credibility issues themselves just because they're on that 24-hour news cycle, and they are definitely they have a partisan bias. But when you have major newspapers that have a history of being legacy news outlets, they're reliable and they're credible, and suddenly someone can just say, no, you're fake news. What happens? We lose faith in them. We lose a free press. We have someone in power who, if they are corrupt, all they need to do is undermine the press, and then the press cannot question them. It cannot hold them to account. And if they reveal some corruption of this person in power, they can, the public, their readership, can be encouraged not to trust them or to believe them. There's an article in the Upshot called "The Real Story About Fake News is Partisanship." Here's a quote. "The fake news phenomenon is not the result of personal failings, is not limited to one end of the political spectrum. Rather, Americans' deep bias against the political party they oppose is so strong that it acts as a kind of partisan prism for facts, refracting a different reality to Republicans than to Democrats. Partisan refraction has fueled the rise of fake news, according to researchers who study the phenomenon. But the repercussions go far beyond stories shared on Facebook and Reddit, affecting Americans' faith in government and the government's ability to function." So again, we have undermining our faith, not only our faith in the press, but then undermining our faith in the government, causing more division in our country. We have two people working on completely different sets of facts. This is going to cause what you would call division, right? Extremism. If the two sides of the political spectrum and the two parties get farther and farther apart, and we have no moderates, no centrists, no one reaching across the aisle, we have divisions, deep divisions in our country. Does this ring true to you, I ask? Does this seem right? Do you think people in one political party have a wildly different set of facts than someone in another political party? Do you think they can have rational conversations with each other? Rational conversations in which they convince the other person they may be wrong on certain subjects? Or would this phenomenon cause partisanship to get so far that people just cannot be reasonable in discussions and keep open minds? This would lead to more political extremism. So if you, for example, if the public is becoming more and more what we call polarized at opposite ends of the political spectrum, working with different facts, right? Not even believing that the other side is living in reality, right? Then who are they going to elect? They're going to elect people who are more and more extreme to these different extremes. So again, it's important as you're making an argument about fake news and what it means. It's important for you to discuss, maybe in your introduction, why this is important, maybe in your conclusion, why this is something that we need to recognize as a problem in our society, and try to define it so that we can recognize it, right? What can we do to recognize it? So some kinds of criteria match things that you're going to do. A criteria match structure in this argument, and I'm going to talk about this more when we look at there's some pages in our first week about the types of claims, and one of them is the definition claims, and in the definition claims there's this, when you're making a definition claim, you've got this criteria match structure. A categorical claim is when you are placing something into a category. The category here would be fake news. A certain widespread story or a news organization should be placed in the category of fake news, right? It should be called fake news, or should not be called fake news if you want to argue something should not be fake news. So maybe you argued the story about Seth Rich's murder is not fake news. It should not be called fake news because it's a conspiracy theory. It didn't originate from a news organization or a site posing as a news organization, right? It didn't meet this criteria for what the category of fake news is, right? Or the conspiracy theory about Seth Rich's murder is fake news. It should be placed in that category because certain partisan news pundits like Sean Hannity on Fox News discussed it on air as if it might be true. So then you say it does appear to be coming from news organizations, or it's part of this partisan news process. The story circulating online about that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez claimed truck drivers are destroying America is fake news because it's false information, right? That's a criteria. It's placed in the category of fake news because one criteria is that it presents false information. And it came from a website that could be mistaken for real news. Now, this website says it's satire, but they hide that in a different page, and it really does appear to be news, right? That's missing a word, sorry. The story that AOC said truck drivers are destroying America is not fake news because the website where it originated, bustatroll.org, clearly stated on its About Us page that it is parody, satire, and tomfoolery, or as Snopes calls it, junk news, because they're too stupid to understand what satire means. And they labeled the story AOC horror stories, fan fiction. So now in this case, you are making the argument that it needs to appear to be, present itself as a legitimate, as a real news source. And this, even if they hide it, this website does somewhere on it say that it's satire, right? So yeah. Again, let me just to review possible criteria for your essay for fake news, for your definition of fake news. That it must seem to be from a legitimate news source, like it's posing as news. It seems like it's in the style of news. Or that it presents false information, right? It has information that is demonstrably false. It can be proven false, or is like blatantly false, a lie, right? Or those are two possible ones. Or you say that it's motivated by politics, trying to influence politics, or that it has the intention to deceive, right? It has the intention to deceive people, not just by accident. Okay, well, maybe you don't have the intentional deception part, and then something like the bust a troll one here, even though they say it's parody or satire, then it doesn't matter that they weren't attempting to deceive you, because it's hard to tell that it's satire until you go to the About Us page. So it could be accidentally taken as true. And it seems like it's from a news source because the way it's set out, like a headline, right? Is it influencing politics? Yes, it is. Is it motivated to, is the motivation to influence politics? Yes, it is. But if that's not one of your criteria, then you can include things like just like clickbait that aren't, that are about celebrity dying, right? That could be fake news too. That's a celebrity dying could be fake news. Maybe it seems like it comes from a news organization, and if it's not true, that's fake news, and it's not about politics. So maybe that's not one of your criteria. What your criteria are really will depend on what you're trying to argue is or isn't fake news. You could argue about a whole news outlet, like CNN is or is not fake news. Fox News is or is not fake news because of this and that because of false information. And you give some examples of false information they've spread. They present themselves as news. They're trying to influence politics or what have you. A certain program on Fox, I mentioned Sean Hannity. You could look at something like that, or CNN, or whatever side of whatever program or a news outlet you want to talk about. There are really obvious ones like Breitbart, which is a notoriously unreliable and extremist, and you could talk about that being something that would be considered fake news because it meets these criteria, right? This publication or that publication should be in the category of fake news. The Onion, we mentioned The Onion. The Onion is fake news because it's false information. That's my criteria, and it poses as news. Even if it has a satirical intent, it sure looks like news, and there's the possibility that people could mistake it for news because they don't realize it's satire. Or you argue, no, The Onion is not fake news because it's not intended to be taken seriously. It's a joke, right? It's satire, right? So your criteria are the same, that it is in that case your criteria is it has to look like news, has to spread false information, and it has to have the intention to deceive. Okay, so well, maybe it meets two of them. Looks like news, yeah, definitely. The Onion looks like news, and it spreads false information, but it doesn't have the intention to deceive. And so your argument is The Onion doesn't meet my three criteria because it doesn't meet this one right here. It doesn't have the intention to deceive, right? And then you make that argument. A certain cable news network spreads fake news because it has a provable partisan bias, you could say, intends to influence politics, or it isn't fake news because it doesn't intentionally tell lies, whatever you're going to say. A certain prominent public figure. I've never had a student do this, but you could argue that, this public figure, this politician, writes tweets all the time with false information in them. This person is a spreader of false news, right? This person's Twitter account is false news. They're a public figure, and so it is newsworthy. Even if it doesn't seem like it's coming from a news organization, it gets picked up by the news, right? It is false information, and you could talk about that. They're trying to influence politics, and you could talk about that. So you could make that argument. Ideas that might come up in your essay, that the term fake news gets misused. I have a link here to a BBC article, A Brief History of Fake News, which would be pretty good to bring up the idea that we've had fake news for a long time. As a little video talking about fake news. I can't play it for you here. I don't think that the audio will come through. You can argue that biased journalism is not fake news because it's not actually untrue. It's just partisan, maybe unfair. And then you're arguing when people say, "Oh, that newspaper is fake news. That news channel is fake news." Well, they're misusing it, and fake news is really like hoaxes. You could argue, like those fake pictures that get spread on social media, and they're not even from a news source, right? Hoaxes. If a legitimate news channel engaged in hoaxes and they didn't retract it when it was untrue and apologize, they wouldn't be in business anymore. So you could argue that it gets misused. Credible news outlets are misidentified as fake news because, people don't understand, like I was talking about before, editorial direction, news analysis, the nature of news organizations having opinions. They all do, right? What some people call fake news is actually just propaganda or disinformation. You could make that argument. If you're defining fake news as, relating to politics and spreading false information with the intention to deceive, you could say the term fake news is not even useful because we already have a term for this, and it's called disinformation or propaganda. What some people call fake news is simply hoaxes, right? Perpetrated for clicks and ad revenue. We have a term for that too, clickbait or spam, right? So these are things that you could bring up along the way. I'm not suggesting that you have to, though. I had a little video here. I'm not going to share that. It's on YouTube. How fake news does real harm. Stephanie Bussari. You can find it and check it out for yourself if you'd like. There's lots of resources, and I'm going to return to this before the end of the semester. There are lots of resources out there for how to avoid fake news and identify it. You might find some information in there. You know, red flags for obviously photoshopped pictures, a website seeming really unprofessional with lots of pop-ups, unrecognizable domain names, checking the about page, like I mentioned with that bustatroll.org. If you look at the about page and it says it admits that it's fake. If there are no links to back up the things that it's claiming, that's a bad sign. If there are links, look at them. You know, do what's called lateral reading. This is something that we will talk about as well as the course goes on and we get more into during the research component of the class. We'll talk more about source evaluation, things like that. Doing lateral reading is always good. Doing some research on the source that you're on. If something seems too good to be true or very unlikely, it might be. Check the date. Let's see here. You can reverse image search certain images to see if they're real. That's often the case. A very famous fake news story showed Donald Trump on the golf course, and it looked like he had gone to the bathroom in his pants, in his golf shorts, but people tracked down that picture, and it was just they had altered the photo to make it look like that, right? Don't share it, right? If it's fake news. Who made this? How was it made? Why was it made? When was it made? What is this missing, and where do I go from here? Find the source, backtrack the information. Sometimes you determine the path one bit of information took to get to you. This is not always easy to do. If it was a powerful photo or a drowned refugee child, did it come from Facebook, Twitter? What was the original news organization it came from? Do that reverse image search. Try to figure out how the information moves. Reverse image search and check for that truth. Factcheck.org is good. Snopes.com. PolitiFact. Those are all good sources for fact checking, and they usually debunk false stories pretty quick when they go viral. Media bias fact check I mentioned earlier. That's a good one to check out sources. SourceWatch is one where you can look up a source and it will tell you like the money behind and the money in the like who funds this organization or this publication and who they're connected to politically. Those are good. Check out this video, How to Choose Your News. This is another TED Ed video. I may be sharing these with you a bit later in the class. This is a presentation that I've used in in-person classes before. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop my sharing and just get into this with you. Hopefully you have more of a feel of the topic of fake news and defining it after this presentation. I know is a kind of a lengthy presentation, but we have a lot of reading and writing just in the first week. We only have 5 weeks in this class, and we got to do a certain number of writing assignments. So we are tackling this first one right away. Get a couple under our belts, and before we get to the midterm. Okay. So email me if you have any further questions about this, and make sure you just read the instructions on the first writing assignment, and that may clarify things as well. Okay.